The sun burned over the Texas plains, turning the air into a shimmering veil of heat. A convoy of olive trucks rolled through a cloud of dust toward a fenced compound outside Hearne, Texas. Inside the back of one truck, 30 German women sat in silence, their uniforms faded, faces hollow from weeks of travel. No one spoke. Every bump in the road made the chains on the truck bed rattle like a warning. Liesel Müller, a 27-year-old nurse from Hamburg, held her breath as the truck stopped. The doors opened, and an American sergeant shouted, "Everyone out! Line up for selection!" The word sliced through the air like a blade. Selection. She had heard that word before, in whispers, in stories about camps in the East, in rumors of people who never returned. She glanced at her friend Greta. Greta's lips moved silently. Not again. The women stepped down into the blinding light. Ahead of them stretched a long table beneath a canvas awning flanked by armed guards. Beyond the fence, the smell of smoke drifted across the yard. Someone was burning something. Liesel's stomach twisted. Then she saw it, a column of black smoke curling into the sky. She thought she knew what came next. They stood in 2 rows as the sergeant walked down the line, clipboard in hand. His face was calm, unreadable. He stopped in front of Liesel and asked, "You speak English?" She nodded faintly. "Good," he said. "You're assigned to kitchen duty." He pointed toward the smoke. "Barbecue day." For a heartbeat, Liesel didn't understand. The word sounded wrong. Barbecue. She looked around. Instead of trucks for deportation, she saw a row of wooden tables stacked with pots, pans, and sacks of flour. American soldiers were unloading crates filled with vegetables, slabs of beef, and bottles of sauce. Civilians, ranchers in wide-brimmed hats, were laughing with the cooks. Another guard called out, "Y'all ready to cook?" The German women exchanged confused looks. Then one soldier handed each of them a white apron. No chains, no shackles, just aprons. Liesel felt her knees weaken. A cowboy with sunburned skin and kind eyes stepped forward. "Don't just stand there, ma'am," he said. "We're fixin' to eat." He handed her a spoon the size of a shovel. Behind him, music drifted from a radio. Soft country tunes mingling with the hiss of meat on the grill. The smoke she had feared wasn't from bodies or buildings. It was hickory and mesquite, rising from open pits. For the first time in months, Liesel smelled food that wasn't powdered or boiled gray. The aroma hit her like a memory of another life. She wanted to cry but swallowed hard. Greta whispered, "They're feeding us?" Liesel couldn't answer. One by one, the women were guided to a long wooden table. Piles of bread, bowls of beans, plates already waiting. The Americans sat among them, talking easily, as if this gathering of enemies were the most ordinary thing in the world. Someone poured cold water into tin cups, and the ice clinked like music. Liesel stared at her reflection in the cup's surface. In it, she saw a woman who no longer understood the war. She lifted her gaze to the cowboy across from her. He raised his glass and said, "Welcome to Texas." In that moment, every wall she had built inside herself began to crumble. She had lined up for punishment, for judgment, for another act of cruelty. Instead, she had been chosen for mercy. Later, she would write, "We were lined up for selection, yes, but for kindness, and that was harder to survive than fear." Before that day in Texas, Liesel Müller had already made peace with dying. When her field hospital was surrounded near Saint-Lô, she expected execution or worse. The German soldiers she treated told her stories, wild, exaggerated, but believable in a collapsing world. They said that captured women were paraded through towns, starved, humiliated. "The Americans," one officer swore, "will make you disappear." When the Americans finally took her prisoner, Liesel waited for the cruelty to begin. Instead, she was given water. The soldier who handed her the canteen didn't look like the monster she'd imagined. He was young, freckles under his helmet, his uniform streaked with mud. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked quietly. The word ma'am stunned her more than the capture itself. No German soldier had ever called her that. For 2 weeks, the prisoners were transferred by train, crossing hundreds of miles. They passed through ports, ships, and finally into the endless plains of Texas. The land felt alien, flat, golden, stretching forever. The fences looked too thin to hold anyone. Liesel thought, if they wanted to kill us, they wouldn't bring us here. Still, fear clung to her like a shadow. When they arrived at the camp, she noticed small details that confused her. There were gardens inside the fence, rows of tomatoes and corn. The barracks had screens on the windows to keep out mosquitoes. At the entrance, a painted sign read, Camp Hearn, POW Compound, United States Army. The words United States Army looked neat, official, almost polite. It didn't feel like the Reich's propaganda posters where the enemy was always drawn as a beast. At night, she lay awake listening to the hum of crickets and the distant howl of coyotes. The sounds of Texas replaced the echoes of artillery. It felt too peaceful, too normal. That, she thought, must be part of the trick. The next morning, guards distributed small paper booklets printed in both English and German. They were the Geneva Convention articles. One sentence stopped her cold. Prisoners of war shall be treated with humanity. She whispered the words to herself over and over again. Humanity. The concept felt like a rumor. Other women were just as skeptical. Greta muttered, "They're softening us up before the real work begins." Another woman laughed bitterly. "Maybe they'll feed us before they shoot us." No one believed the kindness would last. But as days passed, nothing cruel happened. The guards were firm but not violent. They addressed the women by rank, issued medical care, even dental checkups. A few Texans dropped off books and magazines at the camp library. Once, Liesel watched a guard help a German nurse fix a torn shoe. She couldn't decide if this was mercy or mockery. Each evening, the prisoners were counted, then allowed to walk the yard. Liesel looked up at the wide Texan sky, so open, so endless, and thought, we are trapped in freedom. Her fear didn't vanish overnight, but with each sunrise, it weakened. Slowly, against everything she'd been taught, she began to believe that survival might not require hatred. Later, she would remember that week not as imprisonment, but as the first time in years she felt safe enough to sleep without her boots on. By the summer of 1944, America had become the largest warden in the world. More than 425,000 Axis prisoners were scattered across the United States, living behind barbed wire but surrounded by abundance. Texas alone held over 50 camps, from the pine forests of East Texas to the sunburned plains near El Paso. To the locals, it was strange but not frightening. Ranchers and farmers called them the Germans, as if they were just another group of seasonal workers. Some camps were so remote that the only guards needed were the endless miles of desert. Camp Hearn, where Liesel Müller was sent, was nicknamed the Fritz Ritz. Compared to Europe's devastation, it was almost a resort. The barracks had wooden floors, clean bedding, and electric lights. Each camp had a mess hall, chapel, and infirmary. Many even had orchestras and theater groups organized by the prisoners themselves. The American policy was clear. Prisoners would be treated humanely, not just to honor the Geneva Convention, but as proof of moral strength. "We don't act like Nazis," one U.S. officer said. "We win by being better." The contrast between German and American camps was almost beyond comprehension. In Germany, captured Allied soldiers were often kept in crumbling fortresses or open fields. Food was scarce, disease common. In Texas, by contrast, each prisoner received medical checkups, fresh uniforms, and 3 meals a day. Most Americans didn't even know the full scale of it. To them, POWs were a distant part of the war effort. But in towns like Hearn, Mexia, and Hereford, the presence of these prisoners became part of daily life. The locals saw them at work in cotton fields, canneries, and sawmills. They were paid 80 cents a day in camp scrip, money that could only be spent on cigarettes, soap, or stationery at the camp store. For many of the women, it was disorienting. They had grown up believing America was a nation of moral decay and chaos. Yet here, even the enemy seemed governed by a kind of order that Germany no longer knew. When Lisel saw the camp doctor sterilize his instruments before treating a prisoner's toothache, she whispered to Greta, "Even their discipline is kind." Some of the guards were just as curious about their captives. A young Texan named Private Wilson told a fellow soldier, "They look like my cousins, except they talk funny." Another added, "You forget they bombed London when they smile like that." Life in Camp Hearn settled into a rhythm. Roll call, breakfast, work details, afternoon rest, evening recreation. The women were allowed to write letters home, though everything was censored. Still, even a few words, "I am alive," were precious. Over time, the line between captor and captive blurred. The Texans saw workers, not enemies. The Germans saw caretakers, not monsters. It was an uneasy peace, but peace nonetheless. For Lisel, the realization came quietly one night as she watched the guards walk the fence line under the moon. She realized they weren't there to threaten her. They were there to make sure no one hurt her again. War was supposed to be measured in blood and bullets. But in America, Lisel Mueller discovered that the math of war could also measure something else: organization, abundance, and mercy. Inside the camp library, a stack of American newspapers told a story she could barely believe. In 1944 alone, the United States had produced 96,000 aircraft, nearly 20,000 tanks, and more trucks than the entire Axis alliance combined. The numbers looked impossible, like propaganda. Yet outside her barracks, she could see the truth. Every crate, every uniform, every spoon was perfectly made, perfectly replaced. Nothing ever ran out. It wasn't just weapons. Each German prisoner received about 3,000 calories a day, more than many German civilians at home. Flour, beans, coffee, sugar, even meat appeared with mechanical regularity. Somewhere far beyond the Texas plains, invisible factories and farmers worked in harmony to feed both armies, the ones fighting and the ones captured. Lisel began to notice the rhythm of American logistics. At dawn, the supply trucks came. By noon, new shipments were stacked neatly in the camp storehouse. Every label was printed with the same precision: U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. She had seen German supply lines collapse under bombing raids, trains stranded for days. Here, the flow never stopped. It was like watching an empire powered not by conquest, but by competence. When the camp officer once mentioned, "We've got over 400,000 prisoners to feed nationwide," Lisel did the math in her head. Hundreds of thousands of mouths, 3 meals a day across a continent, and not a single camp reported famine or disease. That was not chance. That was system. She began to compare it with what she knew of the Reich. In Germany, shortages were patriotic suffering. "Tighten your belt for victory," the radio had said. Here, the guards complained if the coffee ran cold. It was absurd, almost insulting, and yet strangely enviable. Greta, sitting beside her in the mess hall, once muttered, "This is wasteful." Lisel shook her head. "No," she said softly. "It's strength." The American abundance was a weapon in itself, silent but devastating. Every plate of food told the same message: "We can do this forever. You cannot." Even the Red Cross inspectors, neutral and precise, seemed impressed. They recorded the camp's statistics: mortality rate under 1%, full compliance with Geneva Convention Article 13, and adequate medical care for every prisoner. For comparison, Germany's own camps reported triple the death rate even among their own wounded. The math was brutal and undeniable. America had turned compassion into a machine. While the Reich rationed starvation, the United States mass-produced mercy. Lisel's diary from that period captured the irony in a single line: "We thought they would humiliate us with power. Instead, they humbled us with kindness." As weeks passed, that kindness began to work like an acid, eating away the fear and pride that had kept her loyal to a dying cause. For the first time, she wondered if defeat might be the beginning of something better. Because in Texas, even the enemy ate well. And that, more than any battle, showed who had truly won the war. The day the women were assigned to work on the ranch was the day Liesl Mueller finally understood that Texas was unlike anything she'd ever imagined. A group of guards escorted them through a gate that opened into miles of open pasture. The air smelled of hay and sunlight. In the distance, cattle grazed lazily beneath the wide blue sky. Instead of watchtowers and barbed wire, there were fences made for animals, not people. A tall man in a hat approached, boots crunching against the dust. He wasn't a soldier. He was a cowboy. "Name's Tom," he said, tipping his hat. "Don't worry, ladies. You're safe here." The women stared at him, unsure how to react. His tone wasn't condescending or cruel. It was friendly, casual, as if he were greeting guests instead of prisoners. He pointed toward a wooden wagon loaded with tools and feed. "We're short on hands. You help out, we feed you right. Fair deal?" For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Greta whispered in German, "It's a trick." But Liesl wasn't sure anymore. The morning passed quietly. The women worked side by side with the ranchers, repairing fences, hauling water, cleaning stalls. The cowboys didn't watch them like guards. They talked, laughed, and even shared jokes they half understood. When one woman stumbled carrying a pail, a ranch hand caught it before it spilled. "Easy there, miss," he said, grinning. "Ain't no war here." At noon, the smell of grilled meat filled the air. A few prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. Meat was a luxury, even back home. Then one of the Texans walked up holding a tin plate stacked with thick slices of beef and bread. "Lunchtime," he announced. The women hesitated, unsure if they were allowed to eat before the Americans. The cowboy frowned. "What are you all waiting for? Food's getting cold." That was when Liesl realized something strange. The cowboys didn't see them as prisoners. They saw them as people. After the meal, Tom showed them how to ride the horses that roamed the ranch. At first, the idea seemed ridiculous. Prisoners didn't get to ride horses. But he insisted, and soon a handful of women were laughing nervously as they tried to balance in the saddle. Greta, who hadn't smiled in months, shouted with delight when her horse started trotting. For a few brief moments, the war disappeared. That night, back in the camp, Liesl couldn't sleep. The image of the open fields haunted her. It wasn't just the beauty of Texas. It was the freedom inside it. The idea that kindness could exist without weakness, that strength could come from generosity. The next day, the same cowboys returned with more work orders. Before they left, one of them, a quiet man named Jack, walked up to Liesl and handed her a small paper bag. Inside were 2 biscuits and a piece of bacon. "My wife made extras," he said simply. She didn't know what to say. All she could manage was a whispered, "Danke." Jack smiled. "You're welcome, ma'am." It was such a simple exchange, but it left Liesl shaken. That night she wrote in her journal, "The Americans have something stronger than armies. They have decency." The next week, when she and the other women returned to the ranch, no one was afraid anymore. They walked freely between the fences, under the same Texas sun that shone on their guards. It was still a prison, but one that had somehow made them feel human again. By late autumn, the daily rhythm of life at Camp Hearn had settled into something that almost resembled normalcy. But for Liesl Mueller, normal was the last word she would use. Nothing about Texas or America made sense. Every week brought another surprise that clashed violently with everything she had been taught back home. In Germany, ration books had ruled life. Every gram of butter, every crumb of bread had to be justified in the name of the Reich. But in Texas, there seemed to be no such thing as scarcity. It began one morning in the camp mess hall. The women lined up for breakfast, tin trays in hand, expecting watery porridge and a few scraps of bread. Instead, the cook served eggs, bacon, biscuits with syrup, and black coffee. The smell alone was overwhelming.